Welcome to the Disability News Report. I am your host, Jennifer Price. First responders are exposed to trauma on a daily basis, and this constant exposure to death and destruction exerts a psychological toll on them, resulting in post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, depression, and even suicide. In one study of over 750 police officers, researchers found that exposure to critical incidents was statistically correlated with alcohol use and PTSD symptoms. Officers who had experienced more critical incidents were more likely than their colleagues who experienced fewer of such incidents to report experiencing PTSD symptoms and using alcohol. Suicide is one of the most devastating consequences of mental illness. My guest today is Jeff Dill, former firefighter and founder of the organization Firefighters Behavioral Health Alliance. He is at the forefront of bringing this topic into the public sphere to erase the stigma and allow first responders get the help they so deservingly need. That interview is coming up next. Specific coworker's body odor, and so I guess in order to alleviate the problem, she then began to spray air freshener to help out the situation, and then she was fired for spraying the air freshener. There were lyrics, and the lyrics were directly relating to the political time and environment at the time of what was going on, especially in their community. They were simply talking about what they see on an everyday basis. He is not talking about what he sees on an everyday basis to try to bring some sort of political Welcome to the show, Jeff. It's great to have you on.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I'm honored to be here, Jennifer.
Yeah, so I read your research article that you co-authored, and as a former prosecutor especially, I'm really fascinated about this topic. I know that I didn't realize that the suicide rates, for instance, were so high, although I knew that there was at least depression. But I certainly had never thought about it being to the extent of PTSD in first responders. So let's just jump right into everything that your organization is doing in the article that you authored here. You wrote that the suicide rate is higher for, just speaking first on firefighters, it's higher for firefighters than it is for civilians. But I was just also curious that when it came to paid versus volunteer firefighters, can I, if I'm reading your article, can I also just make my own conclusion, or am I jumping to conclusions to think that volunteer firefighters may have an even higher rate than paid firefighters, simply, if nothing else, because of an additional stressor of finances?
Well, it would be a great assumption, but it would be jumping to conclusions only because, even here in 2020, we now estimate that we have like a 65% reporting of firefighter suicides to FBHA. And so saying that, understand there's about 1.1 million firefighters in the United States, and 70% of them are volunteers. So
Right.
where we feel we miss out a lot is on the volunteer side. So when we look at the amount of fire and EMS suicides that we have validated, and the validation is that when I get confidential reports, I contact the fire or EMS chief, or we have families that call us. And so we, at this point right now, here on August 3rd, we have validated 1,530 of these tragic events. And I have personally spoken to about 1,475 chiefs to hear not only the methods, but the reasons and the stories behind it, and not only how they died, but how they lived. So when we say, compare volunteer to career, it's very difficult because we feel like we miss out on a lot of the volunteers.
Okay, and that makes sense. It certainly makes sense. You wrote, and I don't want to get it wrong here, that distraction comes in the form of PTSD. And that type of distraction is no less dangerous when it impacts the decision-making of first responders. So can you just provide a few examples of how it has impacted, or how it could impact, a first responder's response time or how they react to different decision making.
And sure, please understand that when we start looking at the data, I always go back to the data because we collect the state, the ages, the ranks, and we know that there's no discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter if you're career, volunteer, city, suburban, rural, male, female, ages, ranks, it just doesn't care.
Mm-hmm.
And so now that we have so much more data based on the 2017 with the Ruderman report, is that, I mean, this is 3 more years of data that we have collected since then, that we found that the number one known reason for our brothers and sisters taking their lives based on the interviews, based on the data collection, was actually marital and family relationships.
Oh my.
And so number two was depression, and then number three was post-traumatic stress disorder,
Mm-hmm.
based on the things that we see. And then number four was medical and physical, and this has moved up rather quickly, unfortunately, due to cancer in the fire service.
Oh my.
We're getting more and more families calling us saying that our loved ones took their lives because they didn't want to burden us either emotionally or financially.
Mm.
And number five then is addictions. And there's legal and there's financial issues and then combinations. Maybe they saw something horrific on the job, they turned to an addiction and that ruined the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So when we start looking at PTSD and I start looking at the behavioral health and the emotions and being in the fire service 26 years, when I was at BC, I went and got my master's degree, became a licensed counselor. So I really started to understand the behavioral aspect of it and how emotions play a role, not only off the job, but on the job. And one of the things that I talk about is this thing called cognitive disconnect, where we start basing decisions on our emotions.
Right.
And so when we have anger issues or guilt, jealousy, because we look at our data, we found that out of the 1,530, approximately, I think 61 or 62 are murder suicides. And understand this behavior, this we haven't really talked about a lot in the fire service until 2010 when we started collecting data.
Mm-hmm.
And PTSD was rather new for us.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we start seeing things in our minds and we're supposed to be culturally brainwashed, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but we're culturally brainwashed to, hey, you put this uniform on, you act strong, brave, courageous, give help, don't ask for help. I handle all things on my own.
Sure.
And who expects that? Well, our brothers and sisters we work with, the communities we serve, as well as the traditions of the fire service.
Right.
So just as an example, Jennifer, I teach. We have 7 different classes now based on all the data. One of them is training counselors and chaplains. Another one is training family members. And I always open up the workshop for those two by saying, when you hear the term firefighter, in your own mind, Jennifer, what words would come out? What would you think of when I say firefighter to you?
Brave for sure. Brave and strong, certainly to actively go into, a burning building or whatever. The first word I would think is brave.
Right. And so I look and I'll say, guess what? You're culturally brainwashed. Because in 10 years, I have never had anyone say, well, they have addiction issues, they have anger issues, they have divorce rates that are skyrocketing. And so people don't want to look at the negative within the fire service. Now imagine putting that uniform on every day for 20, 25. And I don't care if you're a volunteer or career, military, we track military firefighter suicides.
Mm.
It becomes very difficult for us to admit that we might be struggling with emotional issues. And so based on decisions, we might not make them right because we have an image that we have to portray. And it becomes, like I said, very difficult to struggle either in your personal or professional life on a daily basis.
Oh, it's totally makes sense. I think especially when you are mentioning that the number one factor is marital problems. I wonder if, like you said, if all of them sort of coexist at the same time, right? Maybe someone is depressed or may have PTSD or whatnot, and then that it exacerbates the marital issues that already existed, and then it kind of becomes a domino effect of problems, and then having to internalize all of that, as you said, because you put on a uniform and there's an expectation that one carries with them.
Right. And It's important that we need to understand, and that's why a term I developed is, and we actually named a workshop is, it's called doing an internal size up. Meaning we have to look within ourselves on a daily basis and ask ourselves, hey, why am I acting this way? Why am I feeling this way? And we have to start taking self accountability for our own actions and our thoughts. And the best thing we can do is to listen to others. They see us a lot better than we will ever see ourselves, correct?
Yes.
And so we have to start learning and listening to our support systems, our families, our friends. And it is important. Post traumatic stress, it comes out in so many different ways, as we know,
Yeah.
and for so many different people. And then when you add relationship, health issues, financial, all these combined, the stress and anxiety of the job is just absolutely incredible.
Hmm. And you mentioned the data. I just want to talk about some of the data that was mentioned in your research. You give some terminology and definition to what is considered a critical incident. So can you just give some examples of what has been considered a critical incident based on your research? And then if you don't mind sharing your own traumatic experience, whether it's your first one or the last one that's most vivid in your memory.
Well, and understand a critical incident can be different for so many people.
Hmm.
Say you have two fire medics, they go out on a call, and it's a child that was run over by a lawnmower accidentally. And the one firefighter is just, oh, calm, cool, let's get this job done. And the other one is so upset because he has a 3-year-old daughter, same age, and think, oh my God, is this my daughter? And they talk and they transport the girl to the hospital. Now their next call is an older gentleman who's struggling with cancer. And now the one that was very calm on the girl's call is, oh my God, this is awful because maybe his father is going through cancer or something. And so he relates that to his own family. And we're human beings. And so we do these type of things. And if we start shutting down our emotions, then that really becomes a problem because we start burying things. And so, everyone's heard the word resilience, resilience, resilience. And to me, the start of resilience is talk about what's going on in your life.
Yeah.
And as for my first, as a volunteer, I started as a volunteer before I went career. And we had many horrific ones. In fact, my wife was telling me, she says, well, what about this one? And I can't even remember it. I mean, that's whether I block it or something because it was so bad, but for me, we went for a fire, a barn fire, pretty good size, and right next to it was a trailer. And unfortunately, one of the workers was living in the trailer. And so by the time we could finally get in there, all you saw was just a burnt out cot. And it was just the muscle and the mucus and the mass of the body.
Right.
And it's an image, and I can't say smell because we had our mask on, but it's an image that if I sit here right now, I can see it.
Hmm.
And these things are burned into you, and it's like, wow, man, that was a human being. And I'll never forget that. It was, one of my first real horrific calls, because when you arrive on the scene and people say he's in there, he's screaming, and you just can't get in there, and that's not what we're supposed to do. So, but for my own personal, I think my greatest tragedy, or my greatest triumph and tragedy, it actually came from my granddaughter. Uh, Understand that in 2011, my wife will be married 40 years in November. She moved down to Arizona from the Chicagoland area. I was still working. Reasons being is because my two daughters and our first grandchild, my son-in-law, they moved down to Arizona. And I was traveling. I was working 24, 48. So my wife was alone a lot. And I said, why don't you move down to where our girls are? I'll get my 20 years in, and then I'll move to Arizona. We'll do whatever we have to do. And so that's what she did. She moved down in May of 2011. Well, on August 7th of 2011, my daughter Emily and my wife took our first grandchild, our Lily, to the doctor for what we thought was lazy eye. And I'll never forget the call where I was in Schaumburg, Illinois, driving when my daughter called saying, "Daddy, Daddy, Lily has cancer. Lily has cancer." And so it was just horrific. She had retinoblastoma. And I talk about it in our workshops because I want people to talk about things that truly bother them.
Yeah.
So I flew down there that afternoon, and 1 week later, she's laying in a hospital. She's actually playing around in the nursing station. They took her on that afternoon of the 7th, they took her to Phoenix Memorial to meet Dr. Ann Leverant and said, yes, she has retinoblastoma. 50% of her globe is encapsulated in this tumor. The retina had been detached, and that the right eye has to come out immediately, because if it gets outside the globe and down into the brainstem, well, the optic nerve, we really got problems. So I still have the video on my computer here of her playing around, and I'm talking to her and dancing. Every time I watch it, I go into tears. And so she had the surgery, and I think what bothered me the most is that when they picked her up and took her to in through the back door for the surgery, to hear my daughter wail like I'd never heard anyone on any call in my life. But it was actually my thought process. Hey, I'm supposed to do something here, because not only am I her grandfather, I'm a firefighter. I'm supposed to do something to save that eye. And I believe me, I beat myself up, because that was the mentality. We're supposed to do something. Now this is my family. And I began to isolate big time. Isolation was a big problem for me, because I lived alone. My wife and I went back to work. I was still working as a battalion chief. Around the firehouse, I had my own office and bedroom. So I would eat lunch and dinner, do trainings and things. And maybe once in a while, I'll sit and talk to my company out on the bay floor. But otherwise, I was in my room. On my off days, I would sit in my chair and watch that video over and over again in tears. And when I went to visit my family in Arizona, if my wife wanted to watch a cancer commercial or a cancer documentary, I'd grab the remote out of her hand and say, no, not on my watch. We're not watching this. And it was very tough, because the easy sign to look for retinoblastoma, and this is a PSA, is that you take a picture and with a flash and you get red eye. With Lily, it was red in the left and white in the right. It was the flash bouncing off the tumor in her eye. We went back 8 months earlier and could see it in photographs. We never knew.
Oh, wow.
One red one. And so all those things combined, like, why didn't I see it? I'm supposed to be a paramedic. I'm a fire medic. Why didn't I? Although I'd never heard of retinoblastoma before, it's just the mentality and that culture that we're supposed to be there. And now this is our family. And today she'll be 11 in November. She rides horses professionally. She's just incredible.
Yeah.
But it still is something I still, when I think about it, deal how that was a very horrific time in my life.
Yeah.
And like I said, it can be so many different things for people. And, mine was isolation, but others go into a real bad depression. Some turn into addictions. And it is very real in our world, in the fire and EMS world.
And so it sounds like that sort of dovetails into the next question that I have, dealing with shame. I mean, were these feelings of shame that you had in terms of, wanting to do something and not feeling like you can't do anything because you're not familiar with, eye surgeries and things like that? Because you do talk about that in your article also, that there's a shame around it.
I think it's a shame, or I believe nowadays it's more of a self-confidence,
Okay.
a lack of self-confidence that, hey, can I do my job if I can't even see my granddaughter? Can I come and do my job and serve the public and work with my brothers and sisters? Or maybe those that come back from horrific PTSD calls, where they've gone to 30-day treatment centers. Will my brothers and sisters think that I can do the job? So it's more of that disappointment within itself, the shame that maybe I didn't catch it. I'm embarrassed and inadequate as a professional firefighter, professional medic. All these things play a role on so many, and especially guilt. Guilt is a major factor, as we know.
Right.
And for those that, we have talked to just hundreds and hundreds of firefighters that, felt guilty that they didn't see or say anything of a brother or sister who took their life. Family members, we have an annual weekend retreat for family survivors. And that's one of the big things, they talk about is why didn't they come to us? What did we miss? When you lose someone to a vehicle accident or disease, tragic as that is, there's some understanding to it. But for these, families and friends that have lost loved ones, it carries a lot of guilt. Like, what more could we have done or should have done?
Sure, and you also talk about, and upon realizing that a first responder may need some help, there are also cultural barriers to that person actually receiving the help that he or she may need. Can you discuss that? What are some of those cultural barriers?
Well, a lot of them is pride.
Okay.
You know, I tell my brothers and sisters, please put pride to the side. And another one is that we never talked about behavioral health. In 2010, when FBHA was founded, I started tracking suicides, putting together all this information. And what's different about our workshops, 99.9% come from our brothers and sisters, the data and the information.
Mhm.
So when I walked into my first workshop ever for the Philadelphia Fire Department and about 100 Philly firefighters and said, we'll be talking about PTSD and suicide awareness, you thought I'd had leprosy. Man, we don't talk about those things, and so that culture is that we didn't have the knowledge that these things are happening. And I shouldn't say that because I think we knew they were happening,
Right.
but we didn't have the courage to say anything.
Sure.
And we see that today. And unfortunately, though, because of what we do, we help out a lot of our brothers and sisters. Some will say, "Hey, Jeff, we went and got help. We were diagnosed with PTSD, and we were fired."
Mhm.
And so, because the claim was, no, you can't do the job if you got PTSD.
Mhm.
And so then they keep it within, and people hear this. And if they're, hey, man, if they can fire, Samantha or Joe because they were diagnosed, well, then I'm not going to say that anything that I got bipolar or depression. So they keep it within and they battle it. And and becomes just a continuous struggle. I know we've come a long ways in the fire and EMS world in regard to behavioral health, but we have a long ways to go still.
Sure. I totally agree. I know you mentioned that there is a stigma associated with suicide, that someone who takes his life by suicide is weak. It's a form of weakness. And then when I gave you my response about the first word or thoughts that come to my head when it comes to firefighters, I told you brave and strong. There has not been a lot of major media attention over this issue. I mean, there's been some press, but certainly not as much as I think it should be deserved. The issue uh, should be deserving of it. I wonder if there is maybe a subconscious bias against reporting about this because it's could be contradictory to what people view or how people view first responders. They view first responders as being strong and brave, and subconsciously at least view suicide as being weak, and they're just not comfortable, or they just don't want to report the two.
Right, and it's a mental health issue
Mhm.
within society. I mean, we look at unfortunately at our homeless. How many of those homeless people have some mental health issues? Well, now we look within the fire service. How many of our brothers and sisters? Remember, we're just a slice of America. What's ever out in America is in the first responder world. And now you add that cultural brainwashing. Now you add the work schedules. For volunteers, they're toned out at any time during the day. They work on people that are in their community that they know of. They know, so that's a struggle. And so all these things start coming into play on a daily basis. And when you do it for 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years, it builds up. There's no doubt it is a mental health issue that we need to address. And it really isn't because we were on one of these across the nation news stories a couple months ago. And after it aired, I got so many emails and phone calls from people saying, geez, Jeff, we knew the military and we heard about police, but we never thought firefighters were taking their lives. And I quickly state, and I give out our data, not confidential, just the graphs. It comes in graphs. And yes, for the last 6 years, we've lost just firefighters, more firefighters to suicide than line of duty deaths. And line of duty deaths are 100% reporting, and we estimate 65%. So this is an issue. This is a real problem that we need to address. We need to get Congress to get involved as well so that it will sort of enforce that the cities and the fire districts will all start promoting behavioral health evenly across the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely what grabbed my attention when I saw the article, because I'm in that category and group of people. I had no idea, and I don't even think I would have been able to think about that or make that jump or leap to connect firefighters to suicide. I just did not know that it was happening, and certainly not at the rate that it's happening in comparison to civilians. But just to kind of talk about any legislation, it's my understanding in 2018, the Law Enforcement Mental Health and Wellness Act was signed into law by President Trump. So, what differences have you seen since we're now, 2 years going on 3 years later with that law being enacted? And what does the law do exactly?
Well, in reality, that law is specifically for police officers.
Okay.
So we are trying to put through things through Congress. Congressman Bear out of California contacted me a couple years ago, and he wanted to create this behavioral health for the fire service. He was at a fire department, and they were talking about suicides, and they said, "Hey, you have to call Jeff Dill, man. He's got the data." So he put together a bill that will make a national reporting system for first responder suicides,
Oh, good.
and as well as training, funding for training in behavioral health aspect. And just I think maybe 2 weeks ago, it finally he had to reintroduce it in 2019, new Congress, and it passed through the one of the subcommittees, and now the bill has been sent to the Congress. Of course, whether they get to it, how many bills are passed every year, correct? And whether they address it, I don't know if that'll happen in this Congress or 2 years from now. But it's needed. For each day that we wait and we don't talk about it on a national level, we lose more and more brothers and sisters, and we have more, unfortunately, an increase of family survivors.
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, it's certainly titled Law Enforcement Mental Health and Wellness Act, but it should be more first responders in general, not just, targeting
Right.
certain specific of the population. Or
But it goes back to that belief. Oh well, the police. I mean, look at all the suicides they've had and things, but no, not firefighters.
right.
And then when you start looking at the numbers, and that's why Congress has this bill now. People are realizing we have to do something for our first responders because not only with the stress and anxiety, the PTSD, and now you look at the virus that they're dealing with, the riots that they're dealing with. All these things just add that more and more stress, and unfortunately we're starting to see an increase in our numbers. Not only suicides, but people calling us and saying, "Hey, Jeff, do you have a counselor in my area that I can go to?" And we vet counselors. The National Volunteer Fire Council and FBHA, we put together a national directory of counselors that work with first responders.
Mhm.
And we need these type of things more and more, but it has to be brought out to the public that it's not only military and police, these are our brothers and sisters in the EMS and fire service world that need help. And for not only us to understand, but for them to understand that we are still human beings first.
Well, and when it comes to those counselors, does it matter or make a difference whether the counselor is a first responder or a former first responder? Do you believe the care support would be better or different than receiving support from someone who's not been in that position?
I don't necessarily know if they had to be one, but I think if they were around it or if they were getting training for it, yes, I'm a firm believer. I mean, that's one of the big issues when we started teaching and traveling across the U.S. and Canada was that we don't have any counselors in there. They don't understand what we're talking about. I don't want to walk into a session and the counselor says, "Oh man, you guys are heroes. I can get that in a grocery store." I'm here because I have a problem, and that's to me has been, I think, our greatest improvement in the behavioral health aspect for the fire service and EMS world is that we have so many counselors that are dedicating time to work with first responders. And kudos to my brothers and sisters in the counseling world. And I congratulate them because these are, hey, my wife is a first responder, my husband, my children, my parents. They understand the culture, they understand what their family members have been going through.
Mhm.
And just because they maybe never carried a dead child or anything, or never been into a burning building, they still, through their experiences in their family, through training, we have a workshop that trains counselors and chaplains. We do a mock search and rescue. We put them in gear, we black out their mask, we take a room and we throw a little baby doll in there, and they're supposed to do a search and rescue, under a certain time constraint. And you can see when they're done, their anxiety and their stress and that doesn't even have the fire or the heat and the smoke.
Right.
And so we try to simulate some of these things. We do a lot of role play. this is, the things that you probably should say, probably shouldn't do. And I'm not there to teach them to be counselors. I'm just there to educate them on how to work with us.
Yeah.
And that's a key. And what, like I said, what inspires me to continue on is that so many of my brothers and sisters now are calling and reaching out for help. And there's counselors or chaplains. You get some of the rural places out there, there's not a lot of counselors. They either have to do a chaplain or telehealth. And telehealth has really picked up big due to the virus.
Right.
So, in some small way, it's been very beneficial for our brothers and sisters because now they can sit in the comfort of their home and talk to a counselor, just
Yeah.
like we're doing here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Jeff Dill, thank you for your service. Very, very much so. And certainly thank you for everything that your organization is doing to bring all of these issues to the front, and especially to lobby Congress to create legislation so it doesn't become so much of a stigma, and it becomes more, I guess, acceptable in the community to talk about, discuss, and not be ashamed of.
Absolutely, and I appreciate you wanting to bring this, out front, and telling people, hey, this is what's going on, and for our brothers and sisters in the EMS and fire service.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the interview.
Thank you. You stay safe.
Thank you.